Some women don't have to demand attention. They don't speak the loudest. They don't dominate every conversation. They aren't constantly trying to prove how intelligent they are, how successful they are, or how attractive they are. And yet, the moment they enter a room, something changes. People straighten up, conversations slow down, eyes drift toward them, not because they're trying to be seen, but because they simply are. It's difficult to explain. They don't appear to be performing confidence. They seem to embody something much deeper. Most people call this charisma. Others call it feminine energy. Some call it confidence. But Carl Jung might have called it something else entirely. He might have called it wholeness. Because true presence isn't created by perfect makeup, or expensive clothes, or rehearsed body language. It is created when a person is no longer divided against themselves. Welcome to the Sovereign Path, where we explore the hidden psychology behind identity, shadow work, and becoming the most authentic version of yourself. If you've ever wondered why some people seem magnetic without even trying, or why you've spent years improving yourself but still feel like something is missing, you're in the right place. Because today we're exploring a truth that may completely change the way you think about confidence, and perhaps even the way you think about yourself. Imagine attending a professional conference. Dozens of conversations are happening simultaneously. People are networking, checking their phones, laughing just a little too loudly, trying to make the right impression. Then someone walks in. She isn't rushing. She isn't scanning the room to see who's watching. She isn't adjusting herself every few seconds. She isn't trying to occupy more space. Ironically, she already does, without saying a single word. Have you ever met someone like that? Perhaps she wasn't the most beautiful person in the room. She wasn't the youngest. She wasn't wearing designer labels. Yet somehow, she felt unforgettable. Why? Most people assume it's confidence, but confidence alone doesn't explain it. We've all met confident people who somehow feel exhausting. People who dominate conversations, need constant validation, interrupt others, talk endlessly about themselves. That's not presence, that's performance. And the room can feel the difference. From childhood, many women receive an invisible lesson. Be agreeable, be pleasant, don't be too loud, but don't be too quiet. Be accomplished, but don't intimidate anyone. Be attractive, but don't appear vain. Be confident, but not arrogant. Smile, be nurturing, be productive, be selfless, be successful. Stay humble, be feminine, be independent, hold everything together. The list never ends. Little by little. Many women stop asking one question, who am I? And begin asking another, who do I need to become so I'll be accepted? This is where the performance begins. Not because anyone consciously chooses it, but because belonging has always mattered. For thousands of years, being rejected by the tribe wasn't merely uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Our nervous systems still carry echoes of that reality. So we adapt. We edit ourselves. We hide parts of ourselves. We exaggerate other parts. Eventually, we become so practiced at performing that we mistake the performance for our identity. Carl Jung believed every human being develops what he called the persona. Think of the persona as a mask, not necessarily a dishonest mask, an adaptive one, the professional mask, the perfect mother, the endlessly patient wife, the achiever, the caretaker, the woman who never complains, the woman who always knows exactly what to say, the woman who has everything under control, These identities help us navigate society. In many ways, they're necessary. None of us walks into a job interview exactly as we behave while sitting on our couch in pajamas. The persona allows civilization to function. The problem begins when we forget. It's only a mask. Jung warned that many people become so identified with their persona that they lose contact with who they actually are. And when that happens, something fascinating occurs. People may admire the image, but they struggle to truly feel connected to the person behind it. Because on some level, everyone senses when someone is performing, even if they can't explain how. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling strangely tired, even though the other person was perfectly nice? Maybe they smiled constantly, said all the right things, never disagreed, never revealed anything real. Everything looked polished, but somehow it felt hollow. Now think about someone else. Someone who wasn't trying to impress you, who admitted when they didn't know something, who laughed at themselves, who wasn't desperate to control your opinion, who seemed completely comfortable with silence. Odds are, you trusted them almost immediately. Why? Because authenticity calms the nervous system. When someone's words, facial expressions, body language, values, and emotions all point in the same direction, your brain registers congruence. There's nothing to decode, nothing to question, nothing to defend against. You simply experience them as real. And reality has a weight that performance can never imitate. Here's the irony. The harder someone tries to appear magnetic, the less magnetic they often become. Because trying to control how everyone perceives you requires enormous mental energy. You begin monitoring yourself constantly. How do I sound? Do they like me? Did I say the wrong thing? Should I speak more? Should I speak less? Do I look confident? Do they think I'm intelligent? Every ounce of attention directed toward managing your image. Is attention no longer available for simply being present? And presence cannot exist while you're performing for an audience. So if presence isn't created by beauty, or status, or confidence alone, then where does it actually come from? Carl Jung believed the answer wasn't found in becoming someone new. It was found in reclaiming the parts of yourself you abandoned long ago. Because the women who quietly command a room often aren't trying to become extraordinary. They've simply stopped pretending to be someone they're not. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." At first glance, that sounds simple, almost obvious. But if becoming yourself were easy, why do so many intelligent, capable, accomplished women still feel like they're wearing an invisible costume? Why do they walk into meetings already rehearsing what they're going to say? Why do they apologize before they've done anything wrong? Why do they shrink their opinions around certain people, yet become completely different around others? The answer is both painful and liberating, because somewhere along the way, many of us learned that not every part of ourselves was welcome. Think back to childhood. Perhaps you were told you were too sensitive, so you learned to hide your tears. Maybe you were called bossy, so you learned to soften your voice. Perhaps you were praised only when you achieved something, so your worth quietly became attached to performance. Or maybe you grew up in a home where keeping the peace mattered more than telling the truth, so you became the one who anticipated everyone else's needs before they had to ask. None of these adaptations made you weak. In fact, they were brilliant. They helped you survive. They helped you belong. They helped you receive love in the only ways your younger self understood. But survival strategies have an expiration date. The qualities that protected you as a child may quietly imprison you as an adult. Imagine trying to hold a beach ball underwater. For a few seconds, it's manageable. But eventually, the pressure becomes exhausting. The ball fights to rise. No matter how hard you push it down, your shadow works the same way. Every emotion you've rejected, every desire you've buried, every truth you've swallowed, every boundary you've ignored, every dream you've postponed, doesn't disappear. It waits, not to punish you, but to be acknowledged. Jung famously observed, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." Whether or not those are his exact words, the psychological principle remains profoundly true. Whatever we refuse to face begins to shape us from behind the scenes. This is why someone can appear calm, yet radiate anxiety. They smile, but their shoulders remain tense. They insist they're fine, yet their voice carries resentment. They tell everyone they're happy, yet they secretly envy those who have the courage to live differently. We often imagine authenticity as something we project, but more often, it's something we stop suppressing. Because people don't only hear your words, they experience your contradictions, and before we judge that too harshly, we all have them, every single one of us. The question isn't whether you're fragmented. The question is, are you willing to notice? Have you ever met someone who seemed completely at ease in her own skin? Not perfect, not polished, just real. Maybe she admitted when she was nervous. Maybe she laughed when she made a mistake. Maybe she listened more than she spoke. She wasn't trying to dominate the room. She wasn't trying to disappear either. She occupied the exact amount of space that belonged to her. No more, no less. That kind of woman often appears incredibly confident, but confidence isn't actually what you're witnessing. You're witnessing congruence. Her inner world and her outer world have become close friends. There isn't a constant war between who she is and who she thinks she should be. That inner peace changes everything. Here's something fascinating. Human beings are constantly reading one another. Long before we consciously evaluate someone's words, our nervous systems are asking quieter questions. Is this person safe? Can I relax around them? Are they pretending? Are they hiding something? We don't usually think about this, but we feel it. When someone is deeply connected to themselves, they don't need to manipulate the emotional atmosphere. They aren't silently demanding that everyone reassure them. They aren't scanning every face for approval. They aren't performing confidence while secretly fearing rejection. Instead, they offer something increasingly rare in today's world: psychological steadiness. And steadiness is magnetic. Not because it's loud, because it allows everyone else to breathe. Many women believe they're lacking confidence, but often they're simply over-monitoring themselves. Notice how exhausting this internal dialogue becomes. Should I speak now? Did I talk too much? Was that embarrassing? Do they think I'm intelligent? Should I smile more? Did they misunderstand me? Imagine trying to have a meaningful conversation while carrying a 100-pound backpack. That's what constant self-consciousness does to the mind. Presence isn't about thinking more about yourself. It's about thinking less about yourself, not from insecurity, but from freedom. The woman who commands a room isn't obsessing over how she's being perceived. She's engaged with reality. She's curious. She's listening. She's responding instead of rehearsing. And because her attention is outward rather than trapped in self-evaluation, others naturally become drawn toward her. This is why genuine presence cannot be purchased. It cannot be copied from social media. It cannot be mastered through posture alone. It grows slowly. As you begin recovering the pieces of yourself you abandoned to gain acceptance. The opinionated girl, the creative girl, the ambitious girl, the playful girl, the grieving woman, the angry woman, the woman who says no, the woman who asks for help, the woman who no longer apologizes simply for existing. Every piece you reclaim makes you a little less divided, a little less performative, a little more whole. And wholeness has a gravity all its own, but reclaiming those forgotten parts isn't always comfortable. In fact, it may be one of the most difficult psychological journeys you'll ever undertake, because the shadow doesn't disappear simply because we've recognized it. It asks something much harder. Integration. And that's where true feminine presence is born, not in perfection, but in the courageous work of becoming whole. So, if presence isn't something we can fake, and if reclaiming ourselves is the beginning of becoming magnetic, how do we actually do it? Carl Jung believed that every person carries within them a hidden world, a place where rejected emotions, forgotten dreams, unacceptable desires, old wounds, and unlived parts of ourselves quietly wait. He called this the shadow. Unfortunately, the shadow has become one of the most misunderstood ideas in psychology. Many people hear the word and immediately think it refers to something dark, something dangerous, something evil. But Jung saw it differently. He believed the shadow wasn't simply everything bad about us. It was everything we had learned we couldn't be. Imagine a little girl who is naturally outspoken. She asks difficult questions. She challenges unfairness. She isn't afraid to disagree. Then one day, an adult says, "Why do you always have to argue?" Or, "Little girls shouldn't talk like that." She doesn't stop being bold. She simply learns that boldness isn't safe. So she buries it. Years later, she's an adult. She struggles to speak up in meetings. She apologizes before sharing an opinion. She avoids conflict at all costs. People describe her as nice. But deep inside, she wonders why she feels invisible. Her confidence wasn't destroyed. It was hidden, in the shadow. Now imagine another child. Creative, wildly imaginative. Always drawing, always dreaming. Until someone says, "That's not realistic. You'll never make money doing that." So she becomes practical, responsible, efficient, successful, and quietly disconnected. Her creativity never disappeared. It simply went underground. This is why shadow work is not only about healing your pain, it's also about recovering your power. Have you ever tried holding two magnets together from the wrong side? No matter how hard you push, they resist. Now flip one around. Suddenly, they connect effortlessly. Human beings work in remarkably similar ways. When your outer life points in one direction, but your inner world is pulling somewhere else, people feel that tension, not consciously, but intuitively. You may say, "I'm confident," while secretly believing, "I'm not enough." You may say, "I'm happy," while carrying years of resentment. You may say, "I'm fine," when your body is quietly begging for rest. Eventually, the contradiction becomes exhausting, not only for you, but for everyone around you. True presence emerges when your inner truth and your outer expression finally begin pointing in the same direction. That alignment creates a kind of quiet certainty that doesn't need to convince anyone. Think about the women who have left the deepest impression on your life. Perhaps it was a teacher, a grandmother, a mentor, a friend. Notice something. You probably don't remember them because they had perfect hair, or because they wore expensive clothes, or because they always had the perfect thing to say. You remember them because of how you felt around them. You felt seen, safe, accepted, inspired, calm. Their presence became a kind of emotional shelter. That is the power of psychological integration. People rarely remember perfection. They remember peace. There is another reason integrated women often command a room. They are no longer terrified of silence. Most people rush to fill every pause. Why? Because silence feels dangerous. Silence creates space, and space creates vulnerability. What if no one laughs? What if no one responds? What if people judge me? But someone who has become comfortable with herself doesn't experience silence as rejection. She experiences it as breathing room. She doesn't speak merely to relieve her own anxiety. She speaks because she has something worth saying. Ironically, that makes people listen more carefully. Here's something our culture often misunderstands. People assume kindness creates respect. Kindness matters. But kindness without boundaries eventually becomes self-abandonment. An integrated woman understands something many people never learn. Every time she says yes to something that violates her values, she quietly says no to herself. Over time, people begin sensing that she doesn't fully trust her own needs. And unfortunately, they often follow her lead. But when she begins honoring her own limits, without hostility, without guilt, without apology, something changes. She becomes predictable, grounded, emotionally trustworthy. And trust is magnetic. Not because everyone agrees with her, but because people know where she stands. This may be the simplest definition of presence I've ever encountered. Presence is what remains. When pretending ends. When you stop trying to appear impressive, you become interesting. When you stop trying to appear fearless, you become courageous. When you stop trying to appear perfect, you become believable, and people trust what they believe, not what merely looks polished. Perhaps that's why the women who quietly command a room often seem so unforgettable. They're no longer asking, how can I make everyone like me? They're asking something entirely different. How can I be fully present for this moment? That single shift changes everything. So, if magnetic presence isn't something we're born with, and it isn't something we can fake, then how do we begin cultivating it? What practical changes help us move from performance to authenticity, from fragmentation to wholeness? In the final part of this journey, we'll explore 5 practices that slowly transform the way you move through the world, not by changing who you are, but by uncovering who you've always been. If you've made it this far, you may have noticed something. This video was never really about commanding a room. It was about learning to stop abandoning yourself, because the women who quietly transform every space they enter rarely set out to become magnetic. They simply become whole. So where do we begin? Not with another performance, not with another self-improvement checklist, but with a different relationship with ourselves. Practice 1. Tell yourself the truth. Shadow work begins with radical honesty, not self-criticism, not shame, honesty. Ask yourself questions most people avoid. Where am I pretending? What part of myself am I constantly editing? Whose approval am I still chasing? Where do I say yes while silently wishing I had said no? Where have I confused being needed with being loved? These questions are uncomfortable. But discomfort is often the doorway to freedom, because the truth doesn't imprison us. The truth releases us from pretending. Practice 2. Become comfortable disappointing people. This may be one of the most difficult lessons of adulthood, especially if you've spent your life earning love through usefulness. Someone will be disappointed. Someone may misunderstand you. Someone may decide you're selfish simply because you finally chose yourself. That doesn't automatically mean you've done something wrong. One of the quietest signs of emotional maturity is realizing you can survive someone else's disappointment without rushing to rescue your image, without explaining yourself endlessly, without betraying your own values just to restore someone else's comfort. Ironically, the more willing you become to disappoint people when necessary, the less you need their approval. And the less you need approval, the more natural your presence becomes. Practice 3. Let silence become your friend. The next time you're in a conversation, notice how often you feel compelled to fill every pause. What if you didn't? What if you allowed a moment of silence before answering? What if you listened a little longer? What if you stopped rehearsing your next sentence while the other person was still speaking? Presence grows in stillness. Not because silence is magical, but because silence reveals whether we're responding or merely reacting. Some of the most powerful people you'll ever meet are remarkably comfortable saying less. Not because they lack ideas, but because they no longer measure their worth by how much space they occupy. Practice 4. Reclaim one forgotten part of yourself. Remember the little girl we talked about earlier, the outspoken one, the creative one, the adventurous one, the curious one. She never disappeared. She adapted. Maybe you stopped painting. Maybe you stopped singing. Maybe you stopped laughing loudly. Maybe you stopped dreaming because practicality seemed safer. What would happen if you invited one forgotten part of yourself back into your life? Not tomorrow. This week. Buy the sketchbook. Take the dance class. Speak the opinion. Wear the color you've been avoiding because it feels too much. Apply for the position. Write the book. Start the YouTube channel. You don't become whole overnight. You become whole one reclaimed piece at a time. This may sound strange after an entire video about presence, but perhaps the fastest way to lose your presence is to chase it. Because the moment your goal becomes, how do I make people admire me? You've returned to performing. Instead, ask yourself a different question. How can I become more honest? How can I become more peaceful? How can I become more integrated? Magnetism isn't the goal. It's the byproduct. Just as a tree doesn't try to create shade, it simply grows. And because it grows, others naturally gather beneath it. Presence works the same way. Carl Jung believed that the greatest task of our lives was not becoming someone else, but becoming ourselves. Not the version shaped by fear, not the version built entirely from expectations, not the carefully edited persona designed to earn applause, but the truest version beneath all of it. Perhaps that's why the women who command a room without saying a word so often appear peaceful. They've stopped fighting themselves. They no longer spend every conversation wondering how they're being perceived. They no longer exhaust themselves trying to be everything for everyone. Instead, they've learned something beautifully simple. The strongest presence in the room belongs to the person who no longer needs to convince anyone that they belong there. And maybe that person can become you, not because you'll learn the perfect posture, or memorize the right words, or finally become flawless, but because little by little, You'll stop hiding. You'll stop performing. You'll stop apologizing for the space you occupy, and in that quiet transformation, you'll discover something remarkable. The presence you admired in others was never something they possessed that you lacked. It was what naturally emerged when they gave themselves permission to become whole. If this conversation resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of yourself have you hidden to gain acceptance? Share your reflections in the comments below. You never know who might feel less alone because you chose to be honest. If you're interested in shadow work, Carl Jung, depth psychology, and the journey toward becoming your authentic self, consider subscribing to The Sovereign Path. Every week, we explore the inner world, not to escape reality, but to meet it with greater clarity, courage, and wholeness. Until next time, keep walking your sovereign path.